Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our November meeting. It's nice to see everybody out tonight. And I would like to introduce our speaker, Mike Athanas. Mike Athanas he's one of our members and a local farmer. He was born at Vassar Hospital on March 5th, 1944, and resided at the family farm on Route 9G in Hyde Park. His elementary school was varied as he attended 8 different Hyde Park schools, starting at the St. James Chapel and ending at the old F.D. Roosevelt High School, where he graduated in 1961. He entered the U.S. Army on July 1966 and stayed through 1969 and was stationed at USA Europe in Heidelberg, Germany as a typographic survey computer specialist. Mike held jobs at AT&T, Dutchess County Tax Mapping, Harry Bly Land Surveying, and was in the U.S. Army Reserves from 1974 to 1994. Then worked for Mueller Phipps International as machinist and investment wax molding for 6 years. Also NV Phillips as a lab technician in crystal fabrication and polishing for 25 years. He retired in 2005. Mike's parents were John and Mary Athanas. He has 3 daughters and moved back to the family farm. For the last 20 years, he has grown fresh vegetables for farmers markets, which I'm sure you've seen him in Hyde Park. He was the first to grow hops in the Hudson Valley, ginseng, and peanuts. He converted the farm to a clean solar power generation. His hobbies include amateur winemaking, model building, coin collecting, precision farm tractors, models, and rebuilding vintage tractors. Mike is and has been commander of the Hyde Park American Legion Post 1303 and past Dutchess County commander. He was elected to the Hyde Park Town Board for Ward 1 for 2 years, has been a member of the Hyde Park Chamber of Commerce for 3 years, and a member of our Town of Hyde Park Historical Society for 8 years, joining in February of 2010. Please help me welcome Mike Athanas, who will tell us all about what the farmers and their families did to help the World War II effort. Mike?
Thank you, Patsy. I hope I keep you awake tonight.
Tell us about the farmer's daughter.
One's in Texas, one's in Washington, D.C., and one is living in Port Jervis. The oldest took up the saddle business, and eventually she will take over the farm in a few years' time. Anything else you want to know about the farmer's daughter? All right. What I'm going to do, I'm going to give a little timeline here. Can't hear. I'll try to talk as close to this microphone as I can. Too close. If that's the only criticism I get tonight, I'll be happy. All right, I'm going to start way back when it all started, back in 1609. A fellow named Henry Hudson came up the river looking for a passageway to China. And on his exploration, he discovered a few extra things that he wasn't looking for. And I have a book here from Henry Noble McCracken, how they described Dutchess County in the early 1600s. He writes in a strange way, and I have trouble reading him, but I'm going to try my best. This is from his book, Old Dutchess Forever. As pleasant a land as one can tread upon, as fine a river as can be found, very high mountains, very good people, very old men. The country seems to lack nothing needful for the subsistence of man, well adapted for our people to inhabit, on account of the similarity of the climate and the weather to one's own, referring back to Europe. The land is the finest for cultivation that I have ever in my life set foot upon, and it is also abounds in trees of every description. The land is very pleasant and high, bold to fall withal, as pleasant as with grass and goodly trees as ever they had seen, and very sweet smells came from them. A good ground for corn and for other garden herbs, goodly oaks and walnut trees and chestnut trees, yew trees and trees of sweet odor in great abundance, a great store of slate for houses and other good stores. That was written back in the 1600s about Dutchess County. Well, sounds like paradise, doesn't it? What could possibly go wrong? Now, as the inhabitants came from Europe, we have what we call good agricultural practices now, or GAPs. Well, back then, they raped the land. They took the trees away. They didn't practice any erosion control. They planted the same crop year after year after year. They started at 20 bushels an acre of wheat, and by the time they quit growing grain, it was down to about five bushels. The land was depleted. The topsoil that the early Dutch found was gone. It had all been eroded away. And if you walk in the woods today, you'll find nothing but bare ground, slate, and hard rock. And you say to yourself, after 10,000 years from the glacier, where did all that topsoil go? It's gone. It was eroded away. So that changed farming in the 1800s. It was up till the mid-1800s that they farmed in that manner. They plowed it, they cropped it, and they didn't care about it. There was nothing put back in the soil. In the mid-1800s, the Erie Canal was put in. That changed Dutchess County. We went from a grain-growing county to something else. Animals, poultry, milk, different types of farm products were starting to come about. The Erie Canal brought grain down from the western part of the state and made local grain growing just worthless. There was no money in it at all. So this transition from grain growing to animal husbandry occurred in the late 1800s. About 1900, a national event was going on, immigration from Europe, the Mediterranean, Asia, and the different countries. There was millions of immigrants coming to the country. This is the 1900s. And there was all sorts of wars and things going on in all of those countries. The Balkans, Europe was getting poised for a war. So the immigrants, or the people that lived in that area, including my father and mother, decided it was time to go. So my father came over in 1914, my mother came over in 1916, 17. After my father had been here 2 or 3 years, in 1917, guess what happened? He was drafted into the New York militia. He escaped the country to stay out of the military and ended up right back in it. And if the war had gone another year, if it had gone into 1919, he probably would have been back in his own country fighting against his own countrymen. But the war ended November 1918, and so that took him off the hook. I only just found this out through a picture I found of my father in a World War I military uniform. Didn't know what it was until a great friend of mine, identified it through his cell phone. So my father was here working in Jersey, and he came from a farming family. So about 1926 or so, 1924, excuse me, somehow my father finds out about the farm on 9G and buys a 101-acre piece that we're living on right now. About 1926, a couple of years after that, Mr. Ralph Austerhout was born. One of our famous historians here. And he'll play a role in this story as we go on. All right, so in the early 20s and 30s, the Depression hit about 29, and it sent everything into a tizzy. In the mid-30s, my father must have had some insight to the future because he moved the old colonial farm to 9G. He abandoned the old buildings, the old house, and everything. Now it's just ruins, just foundations. It's amazing how Mother Nature reclaims itself. But he built the barn that we have, the house we have, and the shops in the 30s, not knowing that World War II was on its way. None of the people at that time had really thought about World War II. So I have a sheet of paper from one of my mother's cookbooks. And when they were building the house, they started the house in August of 41. Being up here with a little electric, no communications, they didn't get newspapers, there was no radio to speak of, no television. They basically were isolated. As Ralph had also mentioned in another interview we had together, we were kind of isolated up here during that time frame. In August 41, they started building the house that we live in right now. And I'm going to read you a couple dates. All right, December 6th, the carpenter worked from 6 to 5, and he got paid $3.75. The next entry is Monday, December 8th. No mention of Pearl Harbor, no mention of anything being out of the ordinary. And the carpenter worked until the 20th of December, and that's where he stopped working. There was no more entries after that. So by that time, I imagine they realized the war was on and things had to change. And as Ralph Austerhout has said in an interview, on December 7th, the world changed. And it did. All right, the house remained unfinished right up through the 50s. I remember as a kid, there was no paint on the walls, very little plumbing. It was just the structure. And everything stopped on December 7th. So, what happened, my purpose of being here tonight, what happened to the farms in Dutchess County during the war? Patsy asked me to give a talk about that. I get a lot of my information from Carney Reinhold's book, Dutchess County, the Home Front. All right. Within months of the declaration of war, my father completed the farm buildings, put a silo up, and at that time, silos were a fairly new type of storage unit for farms. They chopped corn, put them in silos, and fed it to the dairy cows every month during the winter as a fresh sort of a feed. We had a modern hayloft in our barn, something that the old barns, the old farms in the area were not equipped at. We have a gambrel type roof on that barn. The old barns were just stick and post, and they shoved hay anywhere they could in the hayloft in the old barns. Ralph worked for Anthony Haynes in the old barn. I worked up there as a kid putting the hay away, and it was just a nightmare, absolute nightmare, because there was no thoroughfare to get the hay stored away. There was no thoroughfare to get it out. It was always agony in those old barns. And most of Dutchess County farms at the beginning of the war were of the old style construction. We were fortunate that we had, at that time, a brand new barn. It was only a few years old, and it was a big hollow, still is, a big hollow second floor with just a trolley in the middle to drop the hay in. And then we went to baled hay later, where we used elevators to bring the hay up. But initially it was loose hay. If you've ever been around loose hay, the dust and the bacteria and the mold and the heat is just enough to make you want to pass out. But we had to work up in the hayloft. As the hay came up on the fork and dropped, we had to shove it aside for the next drop of hay. And that's the first time I encountered hay fever. If anybody's ever had hay fever, it's not a pleasant thing to have. You basically get a fever, you cough and wheeze, and just feel awful for a long period of time. But anyway, we were in pretty good shape because we had a modern barn as of that time frame, and we had the cows underneath in a row. We had a vacuum milking machine equipment, so we were doing pretty good. The old farms, they still had to scurry about. They had cows here, cows there, everywhere, and they were not very efficient. So the government starts to come along and say, the farmers have to produce more. We need more for the war effort. All right, so it becomes a nightmare. Most of the young men in early 42 were drafted or volunteered for the military. They took the people from the factories. They took everybody that was of age at that time for the war effort. And these old farms being very labor intensive, all of a sudden it was a shortage of people to work the old farms. So the farmers turned to city people. They called them city slickers at that time, or urbanites. They would work the farms in the summer months to gather the crops, the hay. If it was a vegetable operation, they would gather the vegetables when they were ready to be picked. A lot of women worked on farms on their vacations or whenever they can get away to work on farms. The farm had no manual labor other than that. Ralph worked at Anthony Haynes as a teenager until he was drafted during the war. So he was one of those people that actually filled in for regular farm workers that were missing. They had been taken away for the war effort. So in this period of time, the equipment they had, I just pointed out, I'm going to talk about this in a little while, but this is a timeline of equipment going from the 30s, early 40s, and mid 40s. All right? It went from a transition of very tired, wore-out equipment that was a beast to work, absolute beast. We actually have that tractor on the farm yet, that F12. And all you do when you're running that tractor, you're taking a shower in dirt all day long. Those iron wheels just throw dirt up in your face all day long. And with all that dirt flying around, they tend to wear themselves out very rapidly. So equipment wasn't too new at that time. What farms had equipment, but it was getting used and it was getting worn. And when the war started, all the spare parts, all the replacement stuff ceased to happen. All that energy, those farm tractor companies went to war effort. And I'll talk about that a little later. But the scarcity of parts, the scarcity of fuel, and the lack of manual labor put a real strain on the dairy and chicken production, beef production, all the different kinds of farming that was going on. So the government, in its ultimate wisdom, decided to up the quotas for eggs, chicken, and dairy. And a local person by the name of Myron Smith, he must have been really involved with everything because he was the head of the Department of Agriculture War Board. He was chairman of the AAA Agricultural Adjustment Agency, and he actually had a dairy farm of his own. I don't know how he worked his own dairy farm, but he worked as the kind of the leader of the war effort in the county. His office was in the Poughkeepsie Post Office building. He received no pay for his efforts, and he basically ran all the agencies that control the war production. All right, in 43, he conducted a survey of 1,700 Dutchess County farms. That was a lot of farms back then. Today, I can count on probably both hands the number of farms left in Dutchess County. Our farm being one of them. And there's just virtually none to be found. There's one over on Cream Street that on and off as a farm. In Millbrook, there's a couple of farms. But these farms today are basically tax write-off farms. They're owned by millionaires. They like the farming genre and use it as a tax write-off. But if any of these farms, and our farm also, cannot support itself. I was in, like Patsy said, I was in vegetable crops. Never made a profit on it. Lots of work, no profit. Any of the farms I talked to, Chuck Mead in Tivoli just sold his farm. He was in 15, 20 markets in New York City. Just sold the farm, and he was making over $1 million a year off of it, and still not making money. He's still paying on stuff that he used last year. But farming is a very, very, very difficult, even at the best of times, occupation. And in about 43, the government levied a price on grain corn. I find this incredible to believe. But the government said that the Western growers of grain corn, which people in the East used as chicken feed and different types of animal feed, be levied at $1.07 a bushel. In the meantime, the farmers out there could get $1.50 a bushel using it for their own purpose. So the supply of grain corn dropped, as it did a couple of years ago when we went to this ethanol system. All of a sudden, these ethanol plants were using grain corn to make ethanol, and it's about 10 years ago, I'm guessing right now. But if you noticed about that time frame, the cereal grains in the supermarkets got more expensive, Wheaties and any products that use corn or any part of corn went up because all that surplus corn went to the ethanol plants. Now, of course, everybody's back to producing lots of corn. We just came back from Buffalo on a trip last month, or early part of this month, and there's lots of cornfields, so people are back into producing lots of corn. So the supply of corn has come back up. But back then, you couldn't turn a switch and get more corn. With this equipment, production was very, very limited. It was time-consuming. It was a very manual demand for it. So the quota for chickens and eggs went up. All of a sudden, everybody started growing chickens. People that have large yards, farms that wanted to expand. Elmer Van Wagner, which had property just up the road here, went from 300 chickens in 42 to 15,000 in 43. You couple that with the problem of no feed, and what do you got? You got a disaster. Well, this fella, Smith, passes away about this time frame, and he died in July of 43. Here he is telling the farmers they got to produce a lot more chickens, a lot more eggs. Come the middle of 43, there's a lot more chickens, but there's no feed. So it's coming to a head here. So the new commissioner, they scrambled to try to figure out what to do. So the new commissioner comes on board. Here's his name, somewhere in here. Anyway, they decide to have the farmers get rid of the chickens that they feel are market worthy or market size, to try to reduce the amount of chickens being grown. All right, so you get this yo-yo effect. You're building up, and then all of a sudden the market's falling apart. So now they're liquidating crop. So a lot of chickens were butchered in late 43. to try to decrease the demand. So in the meantime, the federal government in Washington sort of caught on to the problem, so they had the farm price, the corn price, go up to $1.16, so the farmers out west could justify selling corn to the east to feed the chickens. So that sort of alleviated the problem for 44, but it still became a problem. There still wasn't enough feed for the cows, the chickens, the dairy product, and local growers were just able to keep up with their own herds. They couldn't expand it. Like our farm was it was a 200-acre farm, basically, roughly 200 acres, but we never had more than 50 acres of usable land. So the rest of it's rocks and woods and swamps. Nothing you can do with it. There's no way you can grow anything off of it. So we were limited to what we could grow. We could have got 60 cows. We had 30 head herd, but we could have got 60. But how do you feed them? We don't have the capacity to feed that many cows. So we were limited to what we could produce. And yet the War Board was saying we had to produce more. So I never read anything I read on the research here if those goals were ever actually met or not. Somebody had to make up the difference, but I don't know in this area if the quotas put on the farms were actually met or not. I kind of figure they're not. They weren't. Because these farms could only produce so much for the amount of herd size that they had. And you just can't, there's no way of doing it. If an acre of corn is going to be, if you only can grow 20 acres of corn, that's all you could grow. There's no place else to grow it. So it was a tricky situation. So as 44 came along, things were kind of hit and miss. A little bit more feed became available from out west. What happened was the ones that decreased their herds and flock sizes, now the dealers could kind of juggle a little bit better who got the feed and who didn't. And that's what they were doing. And the people that had a little extra grain would share it with the people that didn't have enough. So it all sort of worked its way out. But in 44, now the tractors that were wore out at the beginning of the war were getting really wore out. The trucks that were being used were wore out. So to improve the war effort, the government recommended that the farms co-opt the equipment. If you had a tractor was running, help your neighbor with his farm work. If you had a truck that was working, pick up two or three farms worth of product and deliver it, not have everybody deliver by themselves. So kind of cooperate and form these alliances that people were sharing equipment. Well, that sort of worked, but still the equipment was wore out. And very little spare parts were coming along. By the end of 44, things were getting better with the war effort. They were building, they had more factories built, more equipment was being produced, and the agricultural manufacturers could go back to tractors and equipment and sort of get the farmers back up into some sort of efficient production. So it sort of caught up to itself in 44. And 45, late 44, they wanted the local farmers to produce as much as they did in 44, or more. So at this point, everybody was geared up. The families had lots of canning equipment. The Victory Gardens were going big time. Everybody was set to produce in 45 enough that they would have food in their own pantry, plus meet the quotas of the government. Well, what happened in August of 45? Atomic bomb. The atomic bomb went off, and the war ended. And immediately, all the war production stopped. They were taking brand new airplanes off of the assembly lines and chopping them up. They didn't even fly. They had never flown. They just took them and chopped them up, put them in the junkyard. Brand new aircraft. All of a sudden there was a surplus of stuff. But the farms were still lacking in their equipment needs. So at that point, I'm going to jump over to the equipment and talk about that. I'd like to thank Carney Reinvolt for his excellent book that I took most of this information out of on chapter 13. If you haven't gotten this book, I highly recommend that you get it. It's the home front of Roosevelt's hometown, small town America during World War II. And he's got a tremendous amount of information in here. So, and I used Old Dutch is Forever by Henry Noble McCracken as that lead-in for what the Dutch saw when they first came here. So here's our little timeline of farm equipment, as best as I can do it in my collection. This tractor was the first of its type in 1932. All farm walls followed this design right up to present, this configuration. Big back wheels, small front wheels, a solid frame. This was the lead tractor, the prototype tractor that everything followed. You can see all the other tractors have the same configuration. All right. The only problem was it was iron wheel tractor, could not be driven on roads, no power steering, no electric start, no battery, no lights, no comforts. It was a solid seat, and if you ran over anything with these back wheels, it'd shake your brain loose. Like I say, we've got one of these. I got it running. I drove it on the farm, and it's a real shaker. It just rattles your brain if you go over anything hard. If you're out in the soft tilled ground, these spikes just basically throw dirt on you constantly. If you go slow, it just tumbles off the side, and the fine particles. You get off that tractor, you're covered with dirt. And I only drove it down the field once and back just to see what it ran like. If you ran that thing 8 to 10 hours a day, you had to be hosed down by the time you got done. Question.
What brand was it? International Harvester?
This was, at the time, Farmwall, but International Harvester and Farmwall merged. It became International Farmwall or International Harvester. They merged about this time frame, and there was a separate company, Farmwall, and there was International Harvester, and they merged, became International Harvester. But they kept the Farmwall name, so the tractors retained the Farmwall name, but the company name was International Harvester. So this was a hand crank tractor. You had to crank it by hand to get it started, and it was only a tractor that could tow implements. Now this is an early plow that was a towed tractor. It was a towed plow. The only thing you could do with this tractor was tow it down the road, pick the plows up, turn around, drop them again, and go back down. There were no hydraulics at that time. There was no power assist of any sort. It was all mechanical. Ford, at the same time frame, came out with this tractor. It's called the Fordson. They actually started building these tractors about 1914. All right, they continued building this style tractor, basically with all iron wheels. Toward the end of the production run, they started putting rubber tires on them. But they were basically, most of its run for the whole line of the tractors being built, the Fordsons, were on iron wheels. Again, no power steering, hand crank start, no generator, just basic tractor. And again, all it could do was pull things. It couldn't lift things. It couldn't do a sickle bar on its own. Later tractors, all that was added to the tractor. So
It didn't have a power takeoff?
the Fordson did not. It did not. The original ones did not have a power takeoff. The Farmwall, that was the big thing. It had a shaft that came out the back called the power takeoff that could actually drive an attached piece of equipment. Like that combine on the far end required a tractor with a power takeoff. There was a shaft that coupled from the combine to the tractor, so when you let the clutch out, the machine would start working. You push the clutch in, the machine stopped working. So it was always a game between moving and having the equipment work. I'll talk about that in a little while. So about 1938, 39, the had been vast improvements in the automotive industry and the aircraft industry, and this design basically needed to be improved on. So they came up with a 1939 Farmall came out with this model tractor. This was a 24 horsepower tractor. A lot of tractor for a little bit of horsepower. But it had electric start, it had headlights on it, it actually had a seat that had a spring in it. Now you wouldn't have to beat your brains loose over the bumps. It had easier steering. The steering was all encapsulated in gearboxes that were sealed. These were open gearboxes so the dirt would wear the tractor out very rapidly. So it had good brakes. It had a pulley to run different types of equipment. It had power takeoff on the back and a swing drawbar. It's big improvements. The biggest improvement was the rubber tires. Now they would cushion your drive over hard ground. You could go on roads with them now. You wouldn't tear the road up. And they actually had as much traction as the steel wheels. So this was a big improvement over this. All right? This cost about $1,200. This cost about $800. But that was a different dollar back then. These right now at auctions go for about $3,000-4,000. Wore out. Totally wore out. They go for that money. All right. About that same time frame, the farm equipment people started realizing there were a lot of vegetable small truck, they call them truck farms. So they came out with this little baby here. This is international also, Farmall, but this is a Cub. This was 9 horsepower. This was 23 horsepower. But it had all sorts of attachments. So this is set up. I have the exact same tractor on the farm that I use for planting in my vegetable growing. It had a planter and a fertilizer hopper, and it also had cultivators that you could attach to it. So you cultivate, you could plant, you could really do a lot of farming with a little tractor. Carl?
On that tractor you're talking about, the wheels are square apart.
Yeah, these wheels could be adjusted in and out.
Front wheels.
Oh, no, these here stayed like that.
The other one is spread out. Is that a reason for that?
These had adjustable front axles, yes. You could spread the wheels out. If you were on a hilly ground and you wanted a little more footprint on the ground so the tractor wasn't so top heavy, you could spread the wheels out, or depending on the row spacing that you planted your crops, you could expand. Like in the onion country down in Goshen, they plant a 4-foot wide swath of onions. So they spread these wheels out as far as they'll go so they can overlap the planting of the onion. They needed the spray, so only spot that wasn't planted was where the tractor wheels went. So they could spread them out. These were adjustable front end on this one. This is a little bit bigger. This was about a 12 horsepower tractor. Next one up from that one. All right, about the same time frame, 1939-40. This tractor, it's not the same scale as these. This is actually a bigger tractor than those, but since the scale I bought it at, it looks like a smaller tractor, but it's not. It's a Farmall Super C. They came out right after the war with that tractor. They realized this tractor was okay, but it needed more horsepower. So they came out with a Super C. These tractors right now go for $4,000 or $5,000 at auction. They cost about $900 to $1,000 brand new. So they're still being used everywhere. That's one of the most favorite tractors for collectors, the Super C. It's a strong tractor, there's parts available, and it's a spunky little tractor. And plus it had a modern design engine, where these engines were of the old design from back in the 30s. They just kept taking that engine and doing a little bit more to it each time. And when this tractor came out, they just threw those designs away, came up with a modern type of engine that they'd learned from the war effort, how to build a small 4-cylinder engine that produced a lot of horsepower versus these big old cast iron blocks that were heavy, produced low horsepower, and this tractor could pull as much as this tractor. I know, I have both of them, and I've done it. All right, so about 42, the war effort kicked into high gear, and all the factories that were producing washing machines, cars, everything else stopped. Somewhere in January or so, they stopped production. There were a few 42. There were a few 42 cars made, a few, not many. It's hard to find them anymore at car shows. You'll see one now and then. Everything stopped. It all went to war production. What are the farmers going to do? They still had to get equipment. So what they did, they took that 1932 idea and put it into a 1940 tractor. They went back to iron wheels in the front, iron wheels on the back. They took the generator out. They took the starter out. They took the battery out. It was back to hand crank. This one's got lights on it, so it must be a little bit newer, but they basically stripped all the electrical system off of it. It was a magneto ignition, same as that tractor had over there, and no hydraulics, just a tow tractor. It was good. It was good at towing. With those iron lugs on there, it really could pull. And usually the combine, this tractor would pull a combine like that. All right, that would be the configuration. It had a power takeoff. This shaft here would hook to this and run the machine. Up until about 1940, 41, most of the grain was being thrashed by the old reapers. They run the reapers around the fields. They make the bundles of grain. They take the grain to a central thrashing machine, which ran off the belts. This here would power a thrashing machine. It'd be a long belt. The thrashing machine would sit here. Guys would come up with wagon loads of sheathed grain, throw the grain into the thrasher. All the chaff would go off in one pile. The grain would go off another way, and there'd be dust everywhere. And the belt would be dancing up and down all day long as they fed that machine. Well, that was very, very, very inefficient. It required people in the field to bind the grain. Can I get a drink of water? Somebody? Getting dry. They had to bind the grain, they had to stack the grain, and they had to put it on a wagon. This is the kind of wagons they used to bring the grain to the thrashing machine. Alice Chalmers, about that time frame, again, this model here is the first of its kind. It was a towed-behind combine that actually cut the grain in the field, broke the sheaths of the head of the grain in this part here, ran the straw out through this duct here. The straw would come out here, and the clean grain would come out here. Thank you, Carney. Put that up there because I'm going to knock it over. All right. So, again, the farms were short on labor. So the farmer's son would man this little platform right here. You would have a supply of bags, and most of the time the grain would go into the bag, and when the bag was filled up, there was a lever here. He shut that off, and the grain would fall into this bin while he was swapping the bag out. He'd take that full bag, tie a string around it, put a fresh bag on there, and turn the lever back so the next bag was being filled. Eventually, this bin would fill up. So they had to have a wagon come up alongside, and this chute here, there was an auger inside, and there was a lever down there that would activate that, and the loose grain would fall into the wagon and be hauled off to where they were going to store it. So, again, they had to put a young kid, and as a young kid, I actually ran one of these. And talk about dirt. You came off of that totally covered with dust, the mold that was on the fruit or on the grain. And it was just a horrible, horrible experience. And I was wondering I could breathe at all because of the dust that we breathed in. There was no face protection. There was nothing. And the tractor was blowing hot air back on you. The dust was coming off of here, coming out of here, coming out of there. You were surrounded in a cloud of dust the whole time you were on that machine. And the guy driving the tractor, he didn't care what you were doing back there. All his idea was to harvest the field. Now, this looks like it's got a 6-foot sickle bar on it. Some of them had a 4-foot sickle bar, so you're only cutting a 4-foot swath every time down the field. You say, well, that takes you forever. If you got a 20-acre field to harvest, that's going to take you forever. And it did. With a 4-foot cut, it took you a good day or better to do a big field like that. But with the old system where they were binding, putting it in sheaves, hauling it to the thrasher, it would take a week to do 20 acres. This machine now could do it in a day and a half. So they got the efficiency way up. Even though there was 2 people involved in running it, versus having a crew of a dozen or 20 people working a field like that. So the war production did increase. The demand and just at the right moment they came up with this machine. I don't know if they sensed the war was coming or not, but this came out about the beginning of the war. And this set the design of everything that followed. Today, the combines have 20-foot wide cutter bars on them. They can do an acre in 4 or 5 minutes. You know, they're driving at 5-6 miles an hour. They're going through these fields, and they're taking a swath 20-foot wide. So the efficiency today, and one man operating it today, where it took 2 here, plus another crew with another tractor and wagon to bring the grain back to where it was going to be brought to. So this was the wagons they had at that time. Basically, it was a horse-drawn wagon converted over with a drawbar that hooked on to the back of the drawbar of the tractor. So they'd have a small tractor like this to pull that back to the barn or the grain bins, where it was going to be. And the Ford line, again, this was up until about 35. This tractor was the mainstay for Ford. It became so obsolete that they just shut the factory completely down in Dearborn, Michigan. So the engineers went to work. They came up with a brand new design. In 1939, they came out with this tractor, and there's still thousands of them around. One tough little tractor. It was called the 9N. The 9 stood for 1939, and N was their designation for tractor, I guess. I don't know where the N came from. But it had rubber tires all around. It had this one doesn't have it, but it had a spring on the seat. It had a steering that wasn't too bad. It was steered a little hard, but it wasn't too bad. It had directional steering brakes. It had a power takeoff on it. And for its size, it's a really spunky little tractor. I have one. It runs beautiful. That thing sat for 20 years, and I had it running within an hour. That's how tough they are. They are a tough little tractor. And you still get all the parts you want for them. They have a deal where they call it a non-serial number tractor. You could actually build one of these from parts that are available today. And it never came off the assembly line as a serial number tractor. It was just something put together from parts from everywhere. They have electronic ignition for them now. They got power steering that you can put on them. Everybody should have one. It's a fun tractor to drive. But that's where it went. And they held this design up to about 64. And then they started going to epoxy design. But this basic 9N design, I have all the series of that on the farm. I got the 9N, I got the 100 series, I got the Golden Jubilee, which was the 1953 model, and the last model they built of that line. And they're all excellent little tractors. They are strong, really reliable, good on gas, and they do a lot of work. So, other than that, we got some questions.
Could you say something about the 8N?
The 8N, all right. All right, this is the 9N. This gets hairy with Ford.
1939.
Yes. The 8N came out in 1948.
That's really bizarre. So
And the 2N came out in 1952.
Very bizarre. So,
Ford used the year number as the tractor number. 9 from 39, 8 from 48. What happened in 48, the reason this tractor came about was because of a completely new lift system developed by Ford and Henry Ferguson. Ferguson was an Irish tractor builder. He came up with this idea of lift arms off the back of the tractor. This one doesn't have them on here, but it should. There's 2 lift arms that could lift the implement up. Remember I said before, all of these tractors were tow tractors. They towed the instrument like this harvester. There was very few of them had attachments that were on the tractor. With the Ford system, they made a basic tractor with a lift system that you could attach all sorts of attachments, mower machines, plows, disc harrows, planters, on and on, buzz saws. It went on and on. They had over 50 attachments for this tractor. And these tractors had maybe 4 or 5 attachments on them. So Ford did a quantum leap over International. The tractor dealers, tractor manufacturers are always trying to do that. If International came out with something, Ford was going to come out with something that was far more advanced. Well, Ford held the patent on the lift system. They call it the Ferguson system. And International could not come out with a 3-point hitch for many years. They finally, when the patent ran out, they came out with a similar system, but not as good, where you actually backed into the implement. There was a couple of forks that stuck out on lift arms. So it was all right, but the Ford system today is still the preferred system after, let's see, 39 to 2018, it's 40, 60, it's 78 years, 78, 79 years. That system is still the preferred system from back in 1939. And if you go to any of these places that sell tractors, some of the newer John Deere yard tractors got little lift systems on them now. It's the same exact design, just tweaked a little bit. So the things that were developed on this tractor followed through. The different air cleaner, the different kind of lubrication system in the engine. The fuel tank was different. Everything after that changed. So the reason I'm talking about this is because I could talk about one tractor and you'd say, where did all that come from? This is where it all came from. This is somebody sat down, they wanted to develop a more modern tractor, and they banged heads for 6 months at International before they decided on that design. There were other designs that would have never made it. That was the proper one to have, and it followed through on all their equipment. Even today, the same type of designs from that 1932 F-12 are incorporated in tractors today. So, any other questions?
we had an 8-inch tractor, and we operated Athanas orchard on 9G across from Haviland Farm. And I bought that tractor. I used that tractor for 31 years. I bought it used. Never put more than $100 in it. It was just mostly spark plugs and changed the fuel line.
So I used the 8N tractor, bought it used from a farmer up on Gretna Road, and this is for Applebaum Orchard on 9G across from Haviland Farm, you know, the silo pizza, and we had an apple orchard there, and it ran forever, and you didn't have to be any mechanical genius because it was just pulling some plugs and very simple stuff, and it was indestructible. And then when I finished, I donated it to our congregation, and it's still running. So amazing piece of equipment. And it was said that this came out in '48. This was a tractor that fed Europe after the war. They sent thousands and thousands of Marshall Plan dollars. 8N tractors went to Europe, mostly Western Europe.
As a side note, same thing happened during the First World War with the Fortsons. when World War I broke out, Great Britain had primitive steam tractors. Henry Ford was an Irish descendant, so he set a factory up, one in England and one in Ireland, and started building these for the British. And when they stopped building them in America, they continued to build them in Europe. And they were built right up into the 60s, basically just modifications of that design. And if you look at anything from Europe, you see old tractors, you can see the Fordson design. It just held right on through. And they went up into the diesels and stuff they ended up with. But they were a sound little tractor. Again, it was a dirt, it threw dirt like crazy. I have one that I ran a few times, and you just bathed in dirt all day long. It's coming off the wheels everywhere. So these with the fenders and the rubber tires, they weren't so bad. Any other questions?
That's a great talk, Mike. Every young boy's dream on that.
I am a docent down at the FDR. This perfect ties in. The exhibit right now is all the posters of World War II. All the posters of World War II. And I mean, they have like 50 to 75 on the wall. They're beautiful. And it shows the home front. It shows the cars, the factories all over. And and they have posters for the farms, for the, because of the need for food for the troops as well as the people at home. And so I would recommend anybody who's got a couple of hours, go this, next few days, because it's going. And they're beautiful posters. Carl can judge that, swear that he saw them. Anyway, so you could carry on this lecture at the FDR Library Museum.
Well,
Okay.
I'm not going to give the hook to
come on.
Mike, but
I got to say something about Ralph.
All right.
Just follow up on your comment. Ralph Alsterhaus's father worked for both the FDR and the Morgan Estates and some on Vanderbilt. And this is a tractor that Ralph's father ran on the estates back in those days. So FDR was given one of these. Nobody knows what happened to it, but he was given a 9N from Ford with the implements as a gift.
And of course, a lot of scrap metal or things that weren't working ended up in the pot to make airplanes in Detroit,
Well, thank you very much.
It's one of the better programs we've had, Mike. Thank you.
Mike, we have something for you. Mike, thank you very much for all your research, and we learned a lot, and I understand you did too, putting it together. We have a little gift for you. We have you a 1-year membership, complimentary for you and Alice, and in the envelope there's a check for you too.
All right.
So we thank you very much.